here to tonight's 5 by 15, and I'm incredibly thrilled to be here with Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall to talk about his fantastic new book, Eat Better Forever. I know quite a lot about food, and I've read an unbelievable number of books about food, and I can honestly say this is about the best one I've ever read. There's a real feeling of someone, an author, who knows this subject incredibly well and has worked out exactly what we need to know to eat better, and I hope eat better forever. So a big welcome from all of us at 5 by 15 to Hugh. And I'd quite like to start there, Hugh, before we start talking about food. I have just seen your Instagram for today, and you have got 4,600 and climbing numbers of people who have watched you literally break the ice on your morning cold swim. Is this true?
Yeah, well, I did have a swim this morning, and I did have to break the ice. And I think that people, it's quite a sadistic view. People enjoy seeing, I mean, not that I'm suffering, because I do it for a curious kind of pleasure. I mean, I do enjoy this, and I've been doing it for quite a long time. And I've got this winter, I've got colder and colder. I've been doing it every day, and in the pond most days. And if I don't do the pond, I have a cold shower or a cold bath. And the water out of the cold tap at the moment is only about 4 degrees as well. So it's pretty bracing. But this morning was sort of a personal best, in the sense that that's the thickest ice I've ever had to break to get into the pond. And no question of a swim. It was just a dip, a smash and splash, I think they call it.
Yeah, that's a good expression. So do you feel really well because of it?
I do. I mean, the thing about it is once you've, for me anyway, having been doing it for this long, I'm very committed, and I can't not do it. And I don't really, I mean, I don't drink coffee in the morning. I have a nice cup of tea and a cold swim. And if I don't have either of those things, I don't feel right, and the day's not ready to start. But today was particularly bracing. I've still got my merino wool thermal leggings on at the moment. Obviously, being Zoom, you don't really know if that might be all I've got on, but actually, I can assure you it's not. But
well, I know I can see that you've got a cardigan on and a shirt.
Well, no, I mean, you know, under the table. But no, I've got those and my jeans on. But I am now toasty warm.
Good. Toasty warm and ready to talk about your wonderful book.
Ready to go. Yep.
What I need to say also before we get cracking on the subject of food is that we're going to allow lots of time for your questions. So please stick them in the Q&A, and we'll come to as many of them as we can. But we'll talk for maybe 35, 40 minutes and then hand it over to everyone there. So please start putting your questions in when you think of them. So we have to really start with the nightmare of COVID and what we now know about the nation's diet and the likelihood of getting sick and indeed of dying. What does it tell us?
Well, it's been the most incredible time, scary time, unusual time. I think for some of us, myself included, there have been upsides. Living in the country here has been an extraordinary opportunity to explore and do new things. But I think for everyone, whether COVID has been a non-stop horror show or whether you've been able to find solace or points of interest, I think everyone feels it's shifted us. Something's changed, and something more can change. There are lots of opportunities to do things differently afterwards. And I think food potentially can be right at the center of how we do things differently. We talk a lot about build back better, but I think it's an amazing opportunity to eat much better. And the things that have changed, there's some really obvious things, like it seems that half the nation now makes sourdough bread and the other half makes banana bread, and you kind of have to decide which camp you're in. I suspect actually that about 98% of the nation probably does neither, but there's been an awful lot of chatter about both. But I think people are cooking more. A lot of people are cooking more. People are teaching themselves to cook during lockdown and taking on new ideas. But one of the most important things for me is the politics of food seems to have shifted a bit. And not just, I mean, I don't mean people's personal politics of food, that's also shifting, but actually governmental politics around food, healthy eating, the obesity problem have shifted. And they shifted because our Prime Minister, or in large part because our Prime Minister got COVID and was big enough, but no pun, well, pun intended if you like, was big enough to admit that his size, his weight was a factor in the severity of his symptoms, and said afterwards that, you know, he wants to do something and his government wants to do something for the nation's health and more importantly for the nation's diet, because up till this point Boris has tended to say we all need to, you know, we need to get on our bikes and run around the park, and there's been an ideological issue for Boris, but for the government, this party generally, in intervening in our lives and helping us change the way we behave around food, and indeed helping us towards better food decisions. It's like, we don't tell people what to eat. We're not the nanny state. And there has been a lot of reluctance. Now, that's completely gone out the window, not just because of the Prime Minister's personal experience, but also because you know, it no longer makes sense to say we're a government that doesn't like to interfere with people's health, because what are we in the middle of other than the biggest health intervention, not just nationally but globally? And every single day the government's telling us to do things differently and behave in a different way for the sake of our health. So the cat's kind of out of the bag and the opportunity is there, and the government has made a commitment to reduce childhood obesity by 50% by 2030 a while ago, but it started committing to pulling some of the levers that might help get that job done, like sweets and confectionery and unhealthy foods at the checkouts in supermarkets, and perhaps most importantly of all, the relentless advertising of junk food to our kids through TV shows and now more and more online. The government has pledged to take action on that. There are lots of levers they could pull, and to be honest, if they're going to get anywhere near that ambition of 50% by 2030, they're kind of going to pull them all, and we're all going to have to change our own behavior a little bit. But I think we're getting away from this idea that it's all about personal responsibility, and it's just, you know, it's up to you. I mean, ultimately, we decide at any given moment what we buy, what we eat, what goes in our mouths, and we have the option to decide that we don't eat something. But that isn't really a free choice, not when we are bombarded by billions of pounds worth of advertising telling us relentlessly to make choices that aren't good for us and make us ill. But it's shifting. So we have a government who's at least up for the conversation, who say they're ready to take action. And so that might start to make it easier particularly for those of us who've traditionally found it very, very hard to make different decisions, make different choices, and make better choices around food.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I read somewhere the other day that the average person, or something like 40% of people have put on 6 pounds over the pandemic. And, you know, there has been a big issue of comfort eating. And I mean, I really like to hear your positivity about the fact that the government will do something. I have to say, I still worry that they're going to say, yes, we're really going to take those tough decisions about what people eat, because, well, one reason they've taken a lot of tough decisions and they're a bit frightened of taking any more.
Yes, you could argue that, but you could also argue that, you know, the door's now open for those kind of tough decisions, that you know, the precedent, that the sort of pussyfooting around and not intervening in our lives and our health is over. So the stage is set to continue to make decisions. And I suppose, you know, if the vaccine is done, then they'll have a little bit of space to look at other issues. But I mean, one would want to hedge one's bets. You wouldn't put all your chips on the government getting this right in one fell swoop, because they've spent a lot of time not quite getting it right. or
So,
not being anywhere near getting it right.
Right. No, I mean, we both read yesterday or in the last few days, you know, now the WHO, World Health Organization, acknowledges that bad diet is now responsible for more deaths than tobacco. So I agree with you. It does seem like, you know, the world now has a very good reason to act. So you've written a book that gives us 7 ways. And I know we don't have time to go through every one of the 7. I would love to spend lots of time on them. So can you give us a kind of overview of what your proposal is about how someone eats, someone like me or any of our many? I mean, we have 800 people signed up tonight, so I know it's a subject that people really care about what the food is and, you know, the whole issues around. And we'll come on and talk about the food environment, I hope, before we get to the end, because I think that's so important. But, you know, you look at food across the board. And so what are your 7 things?
The first thing is that, I mean, yes, there are 7. You know, I think there probably could have been 6 or 8 or 9, but the point is, there isn't just one way, and it doesn't make sense to me to frame the idea of healthy eating or dieting as one simple idea or one big idea, because healthy eating is a little bit more complicated than that. Yeah. But also, actually, the slightly more complicated approach with acknowledging that there are a number of different things that are worth thinking about, and a few different levers you could pull personally and habits you could change, might not turn out to be harder than the one big idea, because the one big idea makes everything very binary. And so I'm talking things like, you know, paleo or low carb, or focusing entirely on gut health, or the 5-2, doing some fasting. There's these, I just mentioned, you know, some of the most popular diets of the last decade or so. And one of the reasons they're popular is because they have a grain of truth and value to them. But to me, they don't serve you very well on their own, because success or failure, it becomes very binary. And if you fall off that particular wagon, well, you fall hard. So I've got 7 thoughts, 7 ideas, if you like, 7 mini New Year's resolutions rather than one big one, and they all support each other, and you don't have to succeed at all of them all of the time. I will rattle through them very quickly. The first sort of all-encompassing one is go whole. Eat more whole foods. Get the bulk of your nutrition from foods that are real and whole. You can cook them fine, you can mix them up, you can make all sorts of lovely dishes, but try and get to them before they've passed through a factory and had a lot of the good bits removed and had some completely unnecessary things added, which your body might not understand exactly what they are. So get back to the stuff that's real and whole. The second one is varied, and that's really also incredibly important. If you eat a very wide variety of foods that are mainly whole, and lots of them are plants, you're already off to an absolutely flying start. The third chapter is called Go With Your Gut. So we've got the 3 goes, the positives. Now, the first 2 are really looking after your gut already. But if you want to add in some fermented foods, some probiotic foods that are already rich in friendly bacteria, some kefirs and kombuchas and yogurts and stuff like that, well, that's good. So those are 3 positives. And then we come to those knotty issues. So the chapter 4 is reduce refined carbs. Not necessarily, you can reduce all carbs a little bit if you want, but it's those refined carbs where the good bits have already been taken out. So we're talking about sugars, sugar syrups, flours, basically the malleable starches and sugars and refined fats that have been spun into endless, highly desirable actually combinations by a very, very clever food industry that make them almost impossible to put down. But if we can get past them, then and onto fat, which has been demonized down the years, but is actually essential and carries flavor wonderfully and has got loads and loads of good things in. The only downside of fat, and actually I shouldn't even say it's a downside, a factor of fat that you have to factor in, and that chapter's called Factor in Fat, it's very, very calorie dense. You know, it's twice as calorie dense as sugar. So, but that doesn't mean, but unlike sugar, it's got loads of good things in it, whereas sugar's got almost nothing other than calories that will do you any good at all. So then that's the foodie stuff, and we've got a chapter about drinking, because actually a lot of the things that we are doing, that we're putting in our body that are bad for us, come in liquid form. And we call them drinks, but actually, if they're not water or a herbal tea or mother's milk, which we gave up quite a long time ago, then, well, even mother's milk is more than a drink, but everything else that isn't water or you know, they're foods. So soft drinks are foods. There's frothy coffees with cream and all sorts of things in them are foods. Alcohol's a food. You know, there's lots of stuff in them other than just hydration. And yet our body doesn't always know that they're foods and doesn't always respond to them, doesn't tell us when we have taken on a lot of calories from drink a lot of the time. And then the final chapter, number 7, is called Eat and Sometimes Don't Eat Mindfully.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the wrapper for everything. Just engage whenever you're dealing with food, ideally when you're chopping and cooking too, but certainly when you're eating. Be present with the food. That will help you relish it. That will help you get more pleasure from the right kinds of foods, because you can taste their rightness. You can taste the good that they're doing. You can tune your mind to really engage with and appreciate the good that certain foods are doing. You can tell yourself, you know, if you are necking a kombucha rather than a triple vodka and tonic, you can tell yourself, while enjoying that nice tart, slightly sparkling flavor, that you're sending a load of healthy bacteria down to your gut. Now, you don't always have to take mindfulness that literally, but you can be there and present with your food, and so you can cast that idea back over the first 6 chapters.
That's so interesting. Yes, I mean, that's amazing that you can put it into that that concise sense. And I think one of the really lovely things is that feeling that it's about doing all of these things, and it's not just about, as you say, putting all your literal eggs in one basket. When you talk about the gut, when I was reading the book, it's almost as though you're talking about a whole other, almost another person. A sort of Hugh's gut or my gut, and that it's very much a living presence that needs taking care of. And it's such a, I mean, I know it's obviously been there forever, but actually as an idea that we're all getting our heads around, it is actually very new that we understand it in this way, understand it as an organ that needs support and help and love and attention.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I sort of think of my gut now as a cross between, not necessarily another person, but maybe, I've only just thought of this, but it's kind of like a cross between a brain and a beehive or a colony of ants. You know, it's an organ or an organism almost made up of lots of other different things that are busy and doing important work for the greater good. They're not individually necessarily interested in your welfare on a daily basis, but they do actually. This is at the leading edge of gut health research. So what I'm about to say is not sort of stone cold proven, but it's an idea that's posited that I find very intriguing. The idea that your gut can influence your behavior quite a lot, and that if you look after your gut, it can incline you. It can lead you towards continuing to make the right sort of behaviors to look after it some more.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously correlation is not causality, but there are some very striking correlations between guts and gut biodiversity and mental health and mood. And if that starts to sound a little bit far-fetched, then it's just probably worth stopping for a moment to note that actually all the important chemicals in the body, not absolutely all of them, a lot of them, including neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, are actually synthesized in your gut. You know, the crucial work of creating those messaging chemicals that perform such vital mood controlling roles and help us deal with pain and stress and all sorts of things like that. They're made by your gut, and they're obviously, if your gut's performing well, then everything's going to be working better, and you're going to get, you know, you're running on good stuff. It's been well made by an organ in top form. Then that doesn't seem to me a stretch at all to imagine that that's going to help your mood, help your mental health, and benefit you in lots of subtle ways.
That's so interesting, and something that, I mean, you talk about a great deal all through the book is the necessity of eating variety. And I have to say, sort of, when I read it, I thought, God, our diets have been so narrow. You know, we've just eaten, you know, you make that point about what 60% of the world's calories come from rice and wheat and maize, which is sort of shocking.
60% of our plant calories.
Our plant calories, okay.
Even so, 3 plants. And also the list of common foods basically peters out at about 200, you know, and yet there are, you know, 12,000 or more known edible plants on the planet. And even that 200, I mean, how many of us are even getting close to that? But the diversity bit is hugely important because it's just your insurance policy. It's spreading your bets. These foods have all got lots of good things in, and the other thing that's really important about diversity is that the food synergy. You know, it's foods eaten together either deliberately or by accident often bring things out or aid the absorption of certain crucial nutrients. So like
what?
Well, so really a couple of obvious, a couple of examples using stuff we've heard of. So vitamin C in fruit and vegetables aids the absorption of iron in leafy greens and pulses. Or slightly more obscure one is that an antioxidant called lycopene, which is in tomatoes and has a very kind of useful micronutrient in lots of ways, is absorbed much better if you eat those tomatoes with oil or avocados or fats generally. You could probably spread butter on your tomato and you'd get more lycopene. But so food synergy is something that you get, you know, both, but sometimes by design. If you know a bit about it and you choose to do those things, you can have fun thinking, I'm optimizing my uptake of this, that, or the other.
Do you think like that now?
No, I don't, to be honest. I mean, you know, I found some of this out while I was writing the book, and some of it has stuck and some of it hasn't. But what's really stuck is I'm absolutely determined to eat lots and lots of different things. That doesn't necessarily mean saying sod seasonality and there are, you know, one thing we do know is there are an insane amount of choices in the supermarket. I think it's still good to have a rationale and an idea to take you through your choices. And for me, that's local and seasonal, and that will still, you know, that will, if you're eating the fruits that are in season, the fruits and vegetables, the fruits that have been stored through the winter and the vegetables that are in season, plus pulses and whole grains and, you know, some dried fruits, and, you know, you're going to be doing really, really well. We just have to get out of the rut of, you know, it's lasagna on Tuesday and something else, you know, we've got to just mix it up as much as possible. And for me, one of the great opportunities to mix it up is frankly breakfast, because if at the moment your breakfast is a piece of toast and maybe a bowl of cereal, well, then you've got so many exciting and diverse foods that you could bring into play. A whole raft of fruits. I mean, I eat fruit every single day. It's usually the first thing I eat every morning is a piece of fruit, and if it isn't a fresh crunchy apple, it might be a couple of dried apricots, which I'm quite likely to have soaked overnight in kombucha, because they go all plump and juicy and tangy and delicious. And then I might have a blob of yogurt on that, and I'm practically eating a dessert. You know, it's very, very delicious breakfast to start the day. But we've got to, I mean, it's just very, very useful just to open up our minds a little bit, lengthen our shopping lists, remind ourselves that there are actually a bunch of foods out there that we really quite like, but that we probably haven't had for weeks, if not months, and get back to them, get on their case and get them in the kitchen.
I mean, you yourself have got a lot fitter, haven't you? I mean, you actually put a picture in the book of you some years ago looking a little bit stouter. Is that fair? Sorry, I don't want to, but you have put the picture in. And I put
the picture in the book. I've lost some weight. I mean, I've what I've actually done is settled at a pretty, at a weight I'm pretty relaxed about, having actually been up and down between about sort of 75 and 85, 86 kilos in my sort of most of my 30s and 40s. I went through a fat dad phase, and then I did sort of crunch it down a bit, and then it came, and that's because I was I think the way I've loved food, very, very interested in food. And my sort of food antennae were either on or off. So I was either essentially eating for pleasure and comfort and maybe to offset a little bit of stress, or I was sort of really on the case and being quite kind of abstemious and prohibitive, and had a sort of reasonably lengthy sort of list of forbidden foods that I was, at least for a while, quite successful in avoiding. Now that's changed, and I've just kind of mellowed out into this. I think it's been like this for a good few years now. Pretty stable, moving a little bit with the seasons. Probably actually eating slightly richer food in the winter, and actually maybe putting on a kilo or two in the winter. But my weight goes now between about 74 and 76 kilos, and I'm pretty relaxed about that, and that's done. That's done without counting calories. One thing I do mention in the mindfulness chapter, which we touched on briefly, I do a little bit of fasting, but I do it in a very kind of sporadic way. So I don't usually plan it. I mean, I wake up in one day and think, today actually might be a good idea not to eat. Might be a good day not to eat anything till 2. Why? Because I haven't got to run off and do this, or go and do some filming, or do something stressful. I'm at my desk, I'm writing or whatever, so I'm going to just. So it's just kind of slotted in a fairly easygoing way. Now it's very useful, fasting. It does lots of good things. I mean, of course, it gives you an extended period of time where you're not consuming calories, but in terms of your gut and your general metabolism, a bit of time off allows certain things to go into rest and repair mode, and get us back to being with hunger, which is a state that we've become unnecessarily frightened of. Now, I don't mean to belittle it's really important. I'm not talking about people who have no choice but to be hungry and are hungry because of their financial circumstances and their difficult place in the world. But for those of us for whom, frankly, laying our hands on food isn't a problem, and it's frankly probably too easy a lot of the time, learning to sit with your hunger for a while is really, really constructive, and you can, and it stops being frightening after a while, not least because you know it's only a short walk to the larder. But you do know that all sorts of good things are happening, and you go back to as paleo invites us to do, and it's not necessarily a gimmicky thing to think about how things were when we were evolving, and our guts and eating patterns were evolving over a very, very long period of time, rather than the very short time we've had since the agricultural revolution. Hunger was not necessarily, hunger was a message to go and find food, not to eat immediately. It was very motivating. So people were often hunting when they were very hungry, and it focused their mind and it made them move quickly, and they hunted well, and similarly even gathering. It became a very focused, heightened exercise, and might be a bit of a stretch, but actually I think I work quite well when I'm hungry. I get quite a lot done. I get quite a lot of writing. I can write well when I'm hungry, and then there comes a point where it's like, okay, now I'm going to go and get something to eat. But spending a few hours with a bit of, frankly, by probably ancient standards, pretty moderate hunger is very informative and actually sort of quite consoling, and makes you think, well, actually this is okay.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because the food industry has absolutely gone out of its way to eliminate hunger from our daily life. I mean, you can buy a snack for the car, you can buy sweets, you can eat 24/7 so easily. I mean, I was very struck by you saying, this thing of the combination of sugars and fats, that this did not exist in our kind of prehistory. But and you also say that very good example, no one would sit and eat a whole pat of butter, nor would you eat a bag of sugar. But when you're making a cake and you put those two things together, suddenly you've made something that just tastes sensational. And the food industry obviously figured this out quite a while ago.
That's right. I mean, so you're right. It's a double whammy from the food industry, because not only have they made food constantly available, triple whammy if you like. One, it's constantly available. Two, we're constantly being reminded that it's constantly available, but by advertising and marketing and not just that, but bells and whistles and signs and lights, and if you walk through a mall, that's the foodie bit. I mean, boy, are those different outlets competing for your sensory attention in a way that's incredibly demanding. But then when you get to taste the food itself, they've done some unbelievably clever things that they're very, very good at. And I would be lying if I said to you that I've transcended the pleasure of, I've got past a place where I would ever find any pleasure in a toffee crisp. That's just not true. If I had a toffee crisp right now, I'd really enjoy it. There's loads of, I did the other day? I ate something called a double decker out of curiosity. I hadn't eaten one for so long, and I thought, my memory of that is that the chewy bit basically tastes like sugary plastic. I suppose they'd call it nougat. It's not even caramel, or it's got this weird texture. And I had one to remind myself, and I thought, you know what, double decker I really don't need in my life. Toffee crisp, yeah,
you do need.
That's a classier piece of confectionery. And I do still once in a while have a toffee crisp. And I don't, I mean, I suppose I could tell myself there's a little bit of rice in there. It's probably not brown rice, but I don't really indulge that thought. I said, this is quite a nice thing. I'm really very aware now of that bliss point, they call it, that combination of sugar and fat. And often there's a little bit of crunch in there, because the sound of us enjoying our own food creates a feedback loop of pleasure. And, there's all sorts of smells.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's all sorts of, synapses firing and they've been tested to the hilt. It's not just confectionery. You go into some, Tex-Mex takeaway or burger joint or whatever, and the order in which they've put the meat and the creamy guacamole, and then the nachos, the crunchy bit, and then more of the gooey cheese on top. It's all been worked out. It's all been tested to the point of basically near certainty. And of course, you're casting your net to different people. Not everyone's the same, and not everyone will get turned on exactly in the same way by the same foods, and therefore you get this sense of sort of diversity. My goodness, aren't there a lot of extraordinary choices in this shopping mall? Like Chinese, I could have, I could have a burger, I could have a pancake, I could buy some sweets over here. Many, many different looking, sounding foods, which are derived from many, many different food cultures. But they have some extraordinary things in common. They are very, very often layering fats and starches, not always fat and sugar, but sometimes it's fat and salt and crispiness and crispy starch, as in the nachos and cheese. And look, we do it ourselves at home. When we put the butter on the bread and the jam on the butter, we are just doing our own version. We're making our own homemade version of the bliss point. But it's just worth knowing, back to the mindfulness, that when you're doing this, it's worth knowing what you're doing. And you are creating a food that doesn't really exist in nature. And one of the reasons it's so irresistible is it combines two things that you are hardwired to seek out, principally because of that, when calories were scarce, the calorific loads from very, very sweet ripe fruits and very, very, the fatty bits of animals and fish and also some fatty nuts and things like that. Those were the jackpots, So if you mix the jackpots that never normally got mixed because you ate, one on the seashore and one up a tree or whatever, if you mix the jackpots together and put them in a wrapper, then that's essentially what confectionery is. And it's what cake is and biscuits are and stuff like that. Which is not to say we need to get them out of our lives, but let's see them for what they are. And what I would love to suggest is that we find wholer versions that are better for us to get some of the same pleasure in a slightly less out of control way. And so,
sorry.
Well, I was going to say, you know, we love to bake in this house. My daughter loves baking cakes, and she was a bit skeptical when I said, please, can you make your Victoria sponge with wholemeal cake flour, not wholemeal bread flour, but light wholemeal cake flour, and take 20% of the sugar out, and maybe add some ground almonds to counteract that. And that's our go-to cake, and everybody loves it. And, you know, to be honest, and we've done this at River Cottage with our menus, you know, you can take 20% of the sugar out of almost any cake, biscuit or dessert, and no one will even notice. They might notice in a blind tasting, compare this one with this one. But if they get what they're given, there's more than enough sugar in a reduced sugar version of a lovely dish like a fool or a crumble or whatever it might be. More than enough sugar to keep people very happy. Now, here's the thing we can all do, is we can train our taste buds to get more pleasure from less sugar. And the most clearly obvious way to do that, many of us will have done this in our lives, is taking the sugar out of our tea and coffee. Well, that worked, didn't it? It actually took me several attempts. And I remember thinking, you know, I got down to my last half teaspoon of sugar. I thought, I'm never going to be able to give that up. And I had several attempts, and it just, I'll do 5 or 6 days. And somebody just once said, it takes 2 weeks. And I didn't know where this extraordinary piece of wisdom came from, but I thought, all right, I bet it doesn't, but I'll give it 2 weeks. And funnily enough, after 2 weeks, you know, sugar, any desire to have sugar in my tea, gone. And if anyone who's done that will know, if you accidentally pick up the tea that's got the sugar in it, you don't go, oh my God, the joy of tea with sugar again. I've been missing it must be 4 years since. You practically spit it out. It's not what you want. If you have milk in your tea, you've learned to taste the natural sugar. The lactose in the milk is already enough sweetness in that tea to give you lots of pleasure. Now, you can take that knowledge and use it in your cooking in lots and lots of different ways to create sweetness with the use of fruit. I'll put a lot of fruit in my savory salads, little bombs of dried fruit in cakes that are actually very, very low in sugar, cakes or biscuits. So instead of having a kind of sweet sweep, you've got little bombs of raisins going off. Lots and lots of ways you can adjust your cooking and your eating to get more pleasure from things that are good for it, that are sweet, but naturally sweet and good for us.
So we have got lots and lots of questions. I have got lots more, but I'm going to start bringing in some of the questions. So Kate has asked, what's your view on meat in terms of how much we should eat and what kind we should eat?
That's a really, really good question. I'm still an omnivore. I'm still eating meat. In fact, the reason I'm smiling is because my supper after this is actually the tail, heart, and tongue of one of my own cows, which has been made into a very sumptuous winey stew. Actually took it out the freezer last night, and my son, I think, is possibly putting a pastry lid on, but he will be using wholemeal flour in his pastry. Although the last thing I heard, he was thinking of making pomme dauphinoise. I just hope he's not doing the pastry and the pomme dauphinoise. Look, I'm still a carnivore, but I did, partly for a TV show, well, more or less entirely for a series of River Cottage. We did River Cottage Veg every day. I became a temporary vegetarian for about 4.5 months a few years ago for the show. But also the idea was to try and recalibrate and my sort of veg cooking, and teach myself that actually vegetables really can be delicious. So the short, I mean, yes, we've got to eat more plants, much more plants. I mean, I'm very privileged to be able to raise my own meat, just a little bit of it here on our farm. That I'm beginning to think that may be a privilege that's sort of almost untenable because it doesn't really set a great example, and it's not something most people can do. But it is where I'm at, and I do still enjoy meat, but I don't eat meat more than 2, maybe 3 times a week. I've got past more than half my days are meat free. That's not that's not in the diary, that's not calculated or ticked off, that's just kind of how it is. And if I think a lot of us could get to that point, we'd be a bit closer to knowing whether some kind of moderate consumption of meat might be might be workable. But actually, for the direction of travel, it probably isn't. We're going to have to get so radical about climate change and how we use the Earth's resources that this conversation might be very different in 10, 15 years' time. So,
well, I hope, yeah,
for the moment,
it is.
Moderate amounts of home-reared meat are still much enjoyed.
Okay, so we've got a question, and you and I were discussing this earlier, and it's come up from a number of people. But Francis Rubin asks about, this is like you're saying, are we preaching to the converted? What do you do if you're on an incredible budget? What do you do through COVID when you've been stuck with the food bank? How do you have this, especially this feeling about variety?
Yeah, look, I'm painfully aware that there are an awful lot of houses where my book is just not going to land. And if people know who I am at all, they probably think I'm pretty irritating, to be honest. And that's how it is. And there's not a lot I can do about that except try and be a bit less irritating. I mean, I was lucky enough to be able to make a program that got beyond the sort of chopping and cooking side, and we looked at the bigger picture problem of obesity in the UK when we did Britain's Fat Fight. But I met lots of people who really are very challenged by their food budgets and were able to make changes and do things differently. But that doesn't mean it's easy. Now, it would be completely naive to pretend that books like mine or shows like mine can make everything all right and solve problems for everyone. But we've still got to believe that those problems are solvable. So if we're not going to do it, someone else is going to have to do it. And frankly, I believe it's the job of government, going right back to what we were saying at the beginning. One of the reasons people are finding it so hard to eat healthily on low budgets is because the foods that are easiest, because if they have no cooking skills at all, the foods that are easiest to get calories inside their kids are not healthy. They are calorie laden rearrangements of fats, sugars, salts and starches in forms that are inexpensive and easy to heat up in a microwave or take away from the takeaway on the corner. Now, we've got to change that culture, and we can, every time we have this conversation, or, we might hope to bring in a few more people who are on the edges of, who are nearly listening to us, but there's many more who are not hearing us at all. And this is why there's no point in me shouting at them, but I don't mind shouting at the government to do something about that. And it's got to start at school. It's got to be about education. We've got to raise a generation that understands what healthy food is, that understands the importance of vegetables. And I think almost certainly that is skilled enough to cook them. And the idea that it would be somehow old-fashioned or retrograde to teach our children how to cook seems to be so wrong-headed, because at a time when young people see so many problems coming down the line at them, climate, will they have a job? Will they have any money? I mean, if they can cook, if you could just teach them how to cook so they can get some inexpensive ingredients, understand what they are, how to spin them into a tasty meal, how to feed their families when they become parents, that would change everything. That would change so much. Now, I can say that to you, and we can talk about that tonight. That ain't going to reach the people who need that. But if we make that an absolute fixture in the way that we educate the young people from scratch, then we can change that. And then at the same time, having given them the help from the ground up, we have to stop bombarding them with this insane advertising for those very available foods that are inexpensive and are making a lot of people very, very ill.
Yes, we've got a lot of questions around the question of cheap food. Lucy here, Lucy Carmody from Imperial, saying, isn't the problem that mostly food is too cheap because the impacts on climate, biodiversity and agricultural labour has not been priced in? If we price food correctly, use differential taxes on unhealthy food and brought from our own locale, wouldn't we be less wasteful and more choosy? I mean, I think that encompasses an awful lot of questions. I mean, this thing is, why is the stuff so cheap, you know?
Well, a lot of it's cheap because of subsidized agriculture at that time of the evening. Subsidized agriculture, you know, the wheat and the rice and the maize. I mean, if you think about maize, is such an extraordinary story because, you know, the biggest consumption of maize is not as sweet corn, it's not as corn flour, it's not as any kind of flour, it's as high fructose corn syrup. It's as sugar. And in the United States, that's what goes into most soft drinks. And in a lot of other countries in the world, some of the countries still use sugar. But I mean, that was an extraordinary pivotal moment when actually the corn barons thought they were going to get biofuel. You know, Bush Senior was going to give them biofuel. And then that didn't, and then the oil lobby got onto that and they were never going to let that happen. So they got sugar. They basically got to turn corn into sugar. And it's been, you know, it's been spun out a squillion different ways, this, you know, high fructose corn syrup. And there's nothing good in it. You know, the bit of sweet corn, the kernel and the skin that actually have got some quite good stuff in them are no longer there by the time it's in a Coca-Cola, nowhere to be seen. And they probably haven't even gone into human food. You know, that's the craziness of it.
Yes, well, there's
on the subject of food pricing. I mean, there are a lot of extremely good, healthy foods that are not hugely expensive. It would be nice if they were cheaper, but lots of fresh vegetables and fruit are not stupidly expensive. But to transform them into a really delicious, tasty meal, you need to know a little bit. You don't need to, you know, be a chef, but you need to have some basic cooking skills.
Question here. Can you foresee a day when industrialized meat is no longer produced? From Mossy Kennedy.
I can, and I think it will. If it does happen, it will be happening in different parts of the world in different times, and different cultures and industrial nations will deal with it on a different time scale, and some will be harder to slower to move than others. But I can imagine it. Yeah, I mean, there's a rather amazing imagining of it by the wonderful comedian whose name I can't remember, but the film is called Carnage. Did anyone see that?
Oh yes.
Simon Amstell, where he imagines a world where we are still processing the fact that everyone's vegan, but we're still processing the fact, the historical fact that we used to kill animals for food, and it's causing a lot of people still are very upset by it. And you know, it's a comedy, but it's interestingly also quite near the knuckle.
Yeah, it's got that brilliant scene, isn't it, in 2050, where you have a cow, an opera about this cow talking about what happened to cows in the past. Do you remember that bit? It was very moving.
Yes.
So there's a bunch of questions too coming in around the whole issue of better farming systems, that our farming systems worldwide are, well, you've talked about maize, but you know, how much they're geared just towards volume rather than quality, and how we can start to look at more regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, I mean, well, again, I mean, a lot of that is tied up with the meat problem, because I think it's a third of the world's cereal crops, and more than 50% of cereal crops in the US are fed to livestock. That's an extraordinary amount of land use, and it's also highly chemical dependent. It's not diverse farming. It's monocultures of a few crops that animals are happy to eat. And so, yeah, yes, of course, we have to rearrange it. We have to look after the soil. We have to learn from, not necessarily fully embrace, but learn from organic systems. there is a tricky bit, which is, of course, a lot of organic systems are very dependent on the muck and manure from animals. But look, these are widely regarded as solvable problems. But the vested interests and the impetus and the energy of industry is still flying so hard and fast in the wrong direction that it's going to take an extraordinary amount of will, or some really compelling natural disasters, of which you could argue that COVID is one, and possibly other sort of droughts and crop failures could be others that would cause a lot of devastation. But just to bring it back to COVID, I mean, COVID is it does seem that COVID is a disease that's been created by our food system, and other pandemics or near pandemics seem to occur when high-tech food production so it has a sort of it kind of encroaches or pushes in to areas that have, you know, where there's bushmeat or where there's other things going on where things come up against each other that don't normally collide, and that's when these grim outcomes start to occur.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the few minutes we've got left, we've got loads of questions. Let's talk about some actual recipes and food. A lot of people want to know what your favorite fermentation is, and like what your favorite kombucha is, and what are the sort of easy ones to make.
Well, I'm drinking kombucha at the moment.
But you didn't make it. Oh yes, you did. Sorry. Okay.
Well, this is me, just my little moment of promotion. This is our River Cottage organic kombucha, which I've been dabbling with kombucha for a few years now, and I wanted to get an organic kombucha on the market that wasn't flavored with kind of ginger and mango and passion fruit and turmeric, but based on English hedgerow flavors and garden things. So we've got that, but I love making my own kombucha too. In fact, I was just decanting my latest brew before joining you all this evening. But I like fermenting, probably actually, if I was, it's the krauts and the kimchis that I'm really hooked into now. They've just got, once you get into that tang, that kind of slight fizz and acidity and little salty edge. Because you have to be careful that saltiness, you know, if you've got kimchi on your plate, you don't want to be slathering everything else in salt too. But I love the tang of those fermented things and all of them. And I actually prefer kefir to yogurt now. I prefer that. I like the fact that it's pourable and I can put it onto my granola or whatever. But I also like that tang and that acidic note, and that very slight fizz. Which just again tells me that it's going to do me some good. It's sending it down to that happy band of microbes that we talked about earlier, that are going to welcome it with open arms.
So what exactly is a kombucha? It's just a fizzy drink, or what?
It's fermented tea.
Right. So
the polyphenols and tannins in the tea, and you do add a little bit of sugar. But unlike, this is an extraordinary thing, which I did have to double check because it sounded almost too good to be true. But when sugar turns to alcohol, it retains all the calories. But when sugar and the other teas, when it turns to what's mainly a form of acetic acid and one or two other acetic acids too, that's a gently exothermic reaction. And actually you lose some of the energy. So some of the calories comes out. So if you start your kombucha at about 8 or 10% sugar, you might finish it on 3 or 4% sugar.
So why is kombucha not alcoholic?
It is, but very, very slightly. Basically, it's got this wibbly wobbly thing in it called a SCOBY, which stands for symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. A SCOBY is like a jellyfish-like plug that sits at the top of your Kilner jar, a bit like a vinegar mother, and it does the fermenting. And the microbes or the bacterias and the yeast favor the production of acetic acid over alcohol and a couple of other acids too. So you get a low alcohol, slightly acidic, sparkling drink where the little sugar that you have added is mostly consumed in the reaction and it's live when you drink it. And for me, it's it's, for me, it's cracked the problem of midweek not drinking, because not only do I still eat meat, I still drink alcohol. And I think with the dinner that's planned this evening, I suspect I will find it hard to resist a glass of red wine. Only you can decide whether I deserve it. But I'm on the kombucha at the moment, and that would be normally it would only be the kombucha on a Thursday night.
Okay, so other questions have come in around what's the best food to eat for your mental health?
Look, I think I'm not a massive believer in superfoods, because the idea that you seek out foods that are somehow more important than I would come back to diversity and variety, lots and lots of different things. I mean, the best thing I think you can do from a food point of view for your mental health is look after your gut. And the next best thing you can do is get outside. Now, that's harder than it has been, but thank God this time around, that's at least been recognized. I mean, I think in the lockdown, during the first lockdown, during that amazing spring, there was a massive error made in where the emphasis was put. If we put all the emphasis on avoiding contact and keeping distance, and we were very, very, very clear about that, then frankly, we could have all spent a lot more time outside, just not very close to each other. And the idea that people were stuck at home for weeks and months on end, were only going out for these tiny little windows, was fundamentally wrong. I've changed the subject a little bit, but I do feel very strongly about that. So I feel the other thing that we need to build back better is our relationship with the outdoors. And I think therein lies an enormous possibility of transformation of mental health for great swathes of the population who haven't really even begun to discover the joys and pleasures of not just being outside, but being outside and with nature.
Okay, we are really nearly out of time, so I've also got some other questions, and I'd quite like to know this too. Actually, I'd really like to know because I've cooked your Asian hot pot from this book, which was incredibly good. Although I forgot to put the coriander on first time, but then I remembered it when I heated it up the next day. It was even better. What's your favorite recipe? Several people want to know.
In the book, or of all time, or
well, you could give us both.
Well, actually, that Asian hot pot is a real winner, because I think what I like about it is it shows you that you can have those incredible umami flavors and lots of layers of different flavor without using meat. But the other thing, I mean, one thing that's going down really well actually in the book is it is my version, the cake I mentioned earlier, it's my seedy almond cake. It's basically a Victoria sponge with less sugar, ground almonds, a bunch of other seeds, and wholemeal flour, and it's absolutely delicious. In the greater scheme of things, I love to eat fish. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I will bang on and on about looking after. Maybe the writing's on the wall for meat. I hope the writing's not on the wall for fish, because it's such an extraordinary food, and I enjoy eating it. I enjoy feeding it to my family, and I don't want it to come off the menu. So probably a barbecued mackerel, on the beach down at Charmouth, or back home in the garden, with a few veg pulled out of the garden, and might put the veg on the barbecue as well. That's the other thing. This is the really important thing about making plants delicious. We just have to do some of the same things to them that we happily do to meat and fish. We need to burn them and barbecue them and caramelize them and spice them and take them a bit more seriously, and just, get busy with them, rather than make them the sad apology on the side when we fetishize the meat. Fetishize your veg a bit.
I was very interested also to read that thing. You said that when you change the way you cook something, you change the benefits you get. And you make that point about the difference between an apple, a raw apple, and a cooked apple, that when you've cooked it, it releases the pectin that is also a really useful thing for your gut.
That's exactly right. Apples, carrots, tomatoes, lots of examples of foods that behave differently, and you get different uptakes of different nutrients, different antioxidants if you eat them raw than you do if you're cooked. And then again, you combine them with each other, and different things start happening as well. So this is the joy of diversity, and of course this variety is also what makes food delicious, and what makes all our culinary endeavours exciting and worthwhile.
On that brilliant note, I'm going to leave you with this image, and this is a book published by Bloomsbury. It is really fantastic, everybody, and I've got another possibly nearly 70 questions that we haven't managed to ask. I'm sorry about that, but actually I flicked through them, and I think pretty much all of them will get addressed in one way or another in this book.
That's the way to do it.
I know, no, he pays, it's fine. Anyway, Hugh, thank you very, very much. And, thank you also on behalf of all of us who care about food for, all the really great work you've done, the great films you've made, the great campaigns you do, the keeping the pressure on the government, because it's the only way to go. And I know we're all privileged here, and I'm sure that most of the people who are listening to us tonight, we do have to keep working to change this system, because actually we all depend, the planet depends on it, and we depend on it. So on that note, happy cooking for whatever you're having tonight. Asian hot pot, strongly to be recommended. Thank you, Hugh. I hope you have a fantastic dinner.
Can I just say thank you very much to everyone who's tuned in. I wish I could see you. I wish it was a live event.
I know.
I hope you've had a good time. I hope you're going to maybe do a few little things differently. And above all, I hope we've recruited you all as food activists to help bring about the changes that we need.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody who's joined in. I see 2 questions have just come in, and I'm really sorry we can't get them. But we'll see you again soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.